I'd like to invite up our next speaker is Dr. Lyman Stone. And Dr. Stone is an American demographer and public policy commentator. He currently serves as director of the Pronatalism Initiative at the Institute for Family Studies. And he is the director of research for the population consulting firm Demographic Intelligence in Charlottesville, Virginia. He also serves as research director at the population consultancy Populi Information. He's received his PhD in sociology in population dynamics at McGill University, researching topics including fertility intentions and realization, fertility policy, and family formation. He focuses on the cause of low fertility and the policy toolkit of taxation, housing, childcare, marriage, and family structure, etc. He emphasizes that policy can, under certain conditions, raise birth rates, and advocates using the realization of families' desired number of children as the core metric for evaluating family policy effectiveness. As head of the Institute's Pronatalism Initiative, he organizes cross-national evidence reviews and policy design. The title for Dr. Stone's talk today is Causal Factors of the Fertility Gap, Its Threat to Economic and Social Stability, Pronatalism Policies, and What Needs to be Done. So thank you. Lyman, please share with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I do apologize if there's some background noise while I talk. I am giving this presentation from an airport, so hopefully I don't get too much TSA noise coming over. As you can see, the title that I was listed as was quite long, so I went with a pithier one. Why fertility falls and what needs to be done. And just in the interest of time, I decided to try and keep the focus here pretty straightforward through a limited set of causes, problems, and solutions. It's not going to be a comprehensive review of everything in this area. I think actually what Dan just did was much more comprehensive in covering the breadth of the issue than what I'm going to do here. What I'm going to talk about is why fertility is falling so much, particularly with a view to the East Asian context, which is so interesting because it is so low. And then I'll talk about what can be done about that. So let's see if my screen will get full. There we go. Okay. So just to start with, the question we would want to ask is what explains the great variation in fertility between high-income countries or industrialized countries. Obviously, Mongolia is not as high income as the USA, but it's a relatively industrialized country with a high life expectancy, high educational attainment. Israel as well. Thailand also has relatively average life expectancy, education attainment, low infant mortality. Then, of course, Korea, Taiwan. And the point here is, in a country like Israel or Mongolia, you can expect each generation to be 30, 40, 50% bigger than the previous one. Whereas in Korea, you could expect it to be only about 30 or 40% of the size of the previous one. This is a huge difference in the implied pace of natural population change. And it's incumbent, therefore, to figure out why is it that all these countries where people basically work, contract wage jobs in formal employment sectors where, in all these countries, women have the right to vote and own property and divorce, these things. Why is fertility so different among these relatively industrialized modern societies? So a second question that I'm going to get to near the end is this interesting little thing that's happened in Korea in the last 2 years. While fertility has been falling, in fact, the pace of fertility decline has actually accelerated in much of the rest of East Asia in the last couple of years. But Korean fertility has actually, maybe, for the time being, bottomed out and seems to be rising a bit. So we're going to look at what might be happening there. So to do this, the first thing we want to ask is, what makes a society good for having kids? In fact, how would we even know if a society is good for having kids? I would suggest the first and foremost way we would do that is by looking at marital specific fertility. So we want to say, okay, of people who are married, partnered, co-residential, and 27, what are their odds of having a child? or whatever. So we look at age-specific fertility within marriage. And that's what this graph is for 5 countries. What I want to draw your attention to is that Mongolia and Israel, I showed you a second ago, have very similar fertility rates overall across the whole society. But Israel has much higher marital fertility than Mongolia does. We'll see why that is in a bit. But the point is, in some ways, Israel is actually a place where more married couples are choosing to have babies. Whereas in Mongolia, there's just more married couples. Okay? If you look at Japan, that's that orangish line, you can see that the average Japanese couple of a given age has a higher likelihood of having a child than the average American couple of the same age, even though the US on the whole has higher fertility. What's going on here? Well, the US has much higher marriage rates to some extent, particularly at younger ages. The US also has higher non-marital fertility, so that's a bit of a separate thing. But my point here is you can often find countries that have very similar overall fertility rates, but how they get there is very different. Some countries may be a wonderful place to have a baby if you're at a place to make that decision, but not a lot of people are at the place to make that decision. We'll come back to that. Another thing I want to point out, this is just an example from Taiwan. Increasingly, the fertility rates of women who have ever been married are separated from the fertility rates of women generally. So you can see in Taiwan, it used to be that the ever married fertility rate and the all women fertility rate were virtually identical. But increasingly, they are separating such that now it's very likely that the ever married completed fertility rate is maybe about 1.8, 1.85 in Taiwan, whereas the overall completed size is probably about 1.2 or 1.3. That's a big difference. That's almost half a child between the ever married group and the overall population. That suggests marriage is having an enormous regulatory impact on the fertility rate. So what I do here is I take these marital fertility rates, these within marriage fertility rates, and I just show them as a percentage of Israel's value, because Israel's the highest. And then I also look at just the overall total fertility rate as a percentage of Israel. And you can see that there's really no correlation. In fact, one of the highest marital fertility rates in Asia is in, or really in the world, is in Taiwan. Okay? Taiwanese couples, once they get married, they have babies. Okay? It's just they take a very long time to get married. Whereas if you look somewhere like the US's actual marital fertility rate is not that high. But we have a lot of non-marital fertility and relatively high transition into marriage. Korea has relatively high marital fertility, but very low overall fertility. And we're going to see why that is in a bit. But my point here is that the places that are the kinds of places where couples decide to have kids, that is where marital fertility is high, are not always the places that have the highest overall fertility, because couple formation is itself a separate, independent regulatory factor on fertility. So here we're just looking at the number of reproductive years that women spend in marriage across time in some of these societies. You can see that Korea and Taiwan in particular have had a rapid decline, whereas Mongolia remains quite high. Mongolia just has a lot more marriage than Japan does. So if we look at the marriage share, so now we're comparing the TFR as a percentage of Israel's to the marriage share as a percentage of Israel's. We see, except for the US case, it's a much stronger correlation. Why is Japanese fertility higher than Taiwanese? Because there's more marriage in Japan than there is in Taiwan. Why? The US is a bit different again because there's a lot of non-marital fertility, but why is Mongolia so much higher than the other places? It's because Mongolia has more marriage than the other places. It's just a question of coupling. So what we've learned so far, couples are still deciding to have kids in Asia at pretty high rates, but fewer couples are forming. And this is a possible candidate explanation for fertility decline. So we can actually simulate this in the case of Korea pretty easily because we have good data. We can say, okay, imagine it's the year 2000, and instead of the actual history that we've experienced, the share of women that were married did what it really did in history, but birth rates by age and marital status were chained at their 2000 levels. So basically, the decision parameter about whether or not to have kids based on age and marital status is held fast at the 2000 levels, but the share of population that's married changes just like it does. That's the gray line. You see, the gray line is actually lower than what actually happened. What that tells us, very simply, is that actually Korea's fertility rates for a given age and marital status have gone up. Even as Korea's overall fertility rate has gone down, the people in a position to decide to have kids have actually been more likely to decide to have kids, which I think is because Korea has been doing a lot of stuff to make having kids better. More financial incentives, more various programs to support families. A lot of this has been happening in the last 15 years. The orange line is, what if you did the opposite? What if you said, okay, birth rates fluctuate exactly the way they did in real history, but the married share is chained to its 2000 level. And what you can see is, if there had not been a decline in marriage, births in 2023 would have been pretty much the same as what they were in 2000. 100% of the decline in Korea's births can be explained by the change in the share of people who are married. That's it. 100%. The entire decline in births is explicable just through changes in the rate at which Korean people are falling in love and getting married. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the whole causal factor, because causality is a kind of different question. This just means descriptively, we can explain it this way, we can decompose it this way. So what we've learned so far here is, if the marriage rates of 2000 have been stable, Korea would have had 2.4 times as many births in 2023. Fertility rates within marital status actually rose over time, even as Korea's overall fertility rate fell, which should tell us that Korea kind of became a better place to have kids if you have a partner to have them. That's the real problem. So if it's marriage, if it's really just about marriage, should we even care about pronatal policy? We don't need to nudge people to have more kids. We just need them to get married. And I want to push back against that a little bit. There's 4 reasons. We should care about direct pronatal policy. That is, policies aimed at having babies, for 4 reasons. First, helping families is just a good idea anyways. Families do vital work for society. They create public goods for society. Helping is good. Second, bigger families can partially offset low marriage. So Korea's fertility would have fallen much more if marital fertility rates had not risen. So the fact that couples in Korea that did get married increased their fertility rate suggests that we can partially offset rising singleness with bigger families of those who do marry. Third, some people might be postponing marriage because they don't think they can afford kids. Making kids more affordable might induce them to consider marriage. And finally, and this is something I want to emphasize, cures don't always have to fix causes. There are multiple people on this call right now who are wearing glasses. Bad eyesight is caused by age and genes, sun exposure. And when people have bad eyesight, we don't go in and reverse their age, edit their genes, and undo their sun exposure. We put glasses on them, or contacts, or LASIK. Cures don't always have to fix causes. Just because declining marriage is the cause of fertility decline doesn't mean that the solution has to be raising marriage back to 2000 levels. There might be other solutions. We might be able to increase fertility within marriage, for example. So if we did want to boost marriage and births, how would we do it? And here we're going to use Korea as our example for some fancy math. And I'm not going to bore you too much with the exact math. Suffice to say, the estimates here are coming from an unpublished meta-analysis. It's going to be published in a volume from the University of Chicago later this year, from 157 different empirical studies of how cash influences fertility. So we have lots of countries that have given people money to have babies, and then we study what happens. And so we can come up with a standard exchange rate, so to speak, between dollar bills and babies. And I know that might sound like a very strange thing to say, but the truth is, humans are rational beings. They follow goals. If you pay them to do something, they tend to do more of it. So let's go through this. I have Japan and Taiwan there just as examples. Then I have the light blue bar here for Korea's actual fertility rate in 2025. Then we ask, what if Korea doubled its monthly child allowance? Right now, you have a 100,000 won a month child allowance in Korea. What if you doubled it to 200,000? Fertility would go up to 0.82. That's not a big effect. Okay, what if the baby bonus, because Korea recently implemented a baby bonus of 2 million won per kid. What if you raised it to 11 million won per kid? Well, fertility would go up to 0.86. Again, that's a pretty modest impact. We can look at its wage replacement. Korea did just increase the wage replacement rate for maternity leave and paternity leave. If you increase that by a similar amount, these 4 policies I show, by the way, the reason I designed these ways is because these are policies Korea already has, and I made sure that they all cost the same amount. All of these policies have similar budgetary costs. They cost 0.1% of GDP. Okay, 0.1% of GDP. Or put another way, they cost 0.4% of the government budget. So taxes would have to go up 0.4% to pay for these. Now you can see at the back end, Korea actually already has a lot of pronatal policies. If they didn't exist, we can also say, what would fertility be? And the answer is, it would be very low. It would be about 0.5, 0.6. So Korea's pronatal policies are already elevating fertility above what it would be without them. So the problem is, as you saw, those effects were pretty small. So maybe it's too expensive. Maybe all these cash policies are just too expensive and we shouldn't bother with them because it costs too much to get more kids that way. But I'm going to say that's wrong. Because if we think about, say, that baby bonus, an 11 million won baby bonus, for those who don't think in terms of won, that's about 20% of GDP per capita. So that's like saying you get 20% of a typical salary just for having a baby, just cash check right off the bat. Okay. That 11 million won baby bonus would cost, like I said, only 0.1% of GDP. That is not actually very much money in the grand scheme of things. So let's do a little hypothetical. What if Korea committed to spending 15% of government spending on a baby bonus? That's about 4% of GDP. So what if Korea said, we're going to try and spend about as much on baby bonuses as we do on pensions? What would happen then? This would be a 168 million won baby bonus. That's the equivalent of 4 years of salary just for having a baby. Okay, just right off the bat. So that's a huge gift to families. What would that do? Well, that would raise fertility to about 1.9 children per woman, almost replacement rate. Now, that's a lot of money, 4% of GDP, that's not nothing. But also, if you ask me, would you be willing to pay 4% of GDP to save your country from extinction? I would say yes. I would pay it in a heartbeat. So it is a lot of money. It's not so much. Now, there might be other reasons we don't want to do that. You might worry about moral hazard. Maybe if you just give people huge amounts of money to have babies, they'll abuse the system somehow. Maybe this will ruin workplace participation. People won't want to work. Maybe this will result in too much public debt. Okay, so there might be other reasons you don't want to spend that much money. But the point is, yes, it could be done. But there is a second path. If we think what we should really do is target marriage, we might wonder, how can we do that? And the first way is to target marriage penalties. Now, I only looked at this for about an hour to figure out what are Korea's policies in these areas. And right off the bat, I found at least 6 different policies that have marriage penalties baked into them. There's a spouse deduction that right now does not fully equalize the treatment of spouses. There's a female taxpayer deduction that particularly discourages women from marrying. There's a household income means test for the earned income tax credit. There's these other programs, the lone parent support subsidy, the basic livelihood subsidy. There's at least 6 different programs where I was able to find in just an hour of looking that there are marriage penalties. So finding ways to get rid of marriage penalties so that people don't lose benefits just for getting married is important. But there is another interesting quirk here. And that is that little increase in Korean fertility in the last 2 years. It's gone up ever so slightly. What's happening there? That's weird. That's interesting. Well, starting in 2024, Korea rolled out a 1 million won bonus for marriage. In the year you get married, the family is paid 1 million won. That was in 2024. It lasts until 2026. Here are 2 different measures for the marriage rate in Korea. One is the crude marriage rate. The other is the total marriage rate, which is controlling for the number of unmarried people exposed to marriage. And you can see, as soon as this policy was implemented, marriage rates rose up immediately. I think what that tells you is that Koreans are willing to marry if the financial package of marriage looks good, if it looks like a good deal. So, cash for marriage might have some of the same problems. Okay, there might be adverse selection or moral hazard or other kinds of public cost issues that we are concerned about. But at the end of the day, it can happen. You can subsidize marriage and get more for it. Now, as Dan was mentioning earlier, cultural, social, religious influences matter a lot. They arguably matter more than finances. The problem is they're very hard to study because we almost never measure them. So this year in 2026 at the Institute for Family Studies, we are going to measure them. If you look in places like the International Social Survey Program, the World Values Survey, the General Social Survey, they often have none of the relevant questions we would want to ask about the cultural influences on fertility. What would your mother-in-law think of you having kids? What would your friends think of it? Do you think kids in your country have a good childhood these days? Would you be happy having kids? These kinds of broader cultural questions about family are almost never asked. So we're going to ask them. In the 2026 IFS Global Fertility Culture Survey, we are going to be surveying respondents in at least 6 or 8 countries, including Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, the US. We're hoping to also do some European and maybe Middle Eastern countries. We're going to be asking these questions about school experiences and upbringing and friendships and social media, coworkers, all these different cultural and social influences that we know impact fertility, but we have a hard time measuring. And we're going to figure out what specifically about certain cultures generates pro or anti-natal results. And the reason I bring this up is not just to say, wouldn't it be cool if we knew these things, but we'd love for people to join our work. The survey is going to begin in April, but we need more partners to reach our target sample size. We'd love to have a very big survey. Right now, it's going to be a moderately sized survey. We'd love it to be even bigger. So if you or a government near you is interested in partnering with the survey program to get better cultural data on family and fertility and social influences on fertility and how we might be able to encourage births without spending insane amounts of money, then please get in touch with me so that we can talk about this. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Stone. That was a deep dive. Actually, we can see that the demographic study involves a lot of factors, and there's a lot of ways you can go with that. Wow.